Amigos e amigas de Carta Capital, sejam todos muito bem-vindos. Eu sou Leonardo Miazzo, editor do site da revista Carta Capital, e tenho o prazer de receber para uma entrevista o professor Staffan Lindberg, fundador e diretor do Instituto Varieties of Democracy do Departamento de Ciência Política da Universidade de Gotemburgo, na Suécia. Todos os anos, o Instituto, mais conhecido como V-Dem, publica um estudo chamado Democracy Report. É um trabalho que mergulha na análise da democracia no mundo. E a edição de 2025, com dados analisados até o fim de 2024, concluiu que o mundo tem menos democracias do que autocracias pela primeira vez em mais de 20 anos. Falaremos nesta entrevista sobre os dados gerais, a situação do Brasil, Donald Trump e o que é possível esperar daqui para frente. A entrevista será realizada em inglês e devidamente legendada. Welcome, Professor Staffan Lindberg. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Professor, how did the Democracy Report come about and what are the highlights of the 2025 edition?
We started measuring democracy around the world back in 2012 and then decided to report the newest data in the Democracy Report since 2016. And the highlights in this year's report is it's getting worse around the world. There's never been as many countries autocratizing at the same time as now. And it's worse than the 1930s that led to World War II. And it's never been as many people living in the world in these countries that are autocratizing at the same time. In terms of the world average, things are still better than it was in the 1960s, but that maybe doesn't say much. But from the height, the top, around 2010, we are now back to levels of democracy in the world we last saw around 1985, the year that, for those who remember, Gorbachev came to power in the Soviet Union and started perestroika and glasnost. So that, I think, puts things in perspective.
Yeah, and the study points out that the most populist type of regime is clearly electoral autocracies, with 46% of the world population, or 3.7 billion people. Is it possible to explain why this movement has gained such strength in recent years?
It's a complicated issue with many contributing factors, but maybe I can point out just a few of what I think are the main ones. So we have China. China has, since the mid 1990s at least, actively supported autocracy and suppressed democracy around the world. So that's one. And then you have Putin came to power in Russia 98, 99, and has since done everything he can to defeat democracy around the world. First with the former Soviet republics, and then going further around the world, you have the Sahel, other parts of the world, but also now, of course, the invasion of Ukraine. So those are two big factors. But there's a third one that's we also state, Saudi Arabia. They started in the late 1980s, spreading their very peculiar, very extreme version of Islam around the world, Salafis. And there are many versions of Islam that are compatible with democracy and human rights and all that. Salafism is not. So they also started and worked against democracy around many parts of the world. So that's another factor. And then we have the vast increase in socioeconomic inequality that also started in the 1980s with Thatcherism and Reaganomics, and then spread to the global south with structural adjustment programs and the Washington Consensus. And it's gone very far. And we have more and more evidence now that people who feel badly affected about this, who view their prospects of the future for them or for their kids to be um, worse, have a tendency to support autocratic leaders, like in Brazil, Bolsonaro. And with that, we have now a rise of, across the world, of far right, populist, and anti-democratic leaders, parties, movements that are gaining support. And they come into elections, come into power by elections, often democratic elections, just like Bolsonaro or Trump, or Orban in Hungary, or Erdogan in Turkey, Modi in India, and so on. And then once in power, they start to dismantle democracy and do away with political opposition.
Professor, you've mentioned Bolsonaro. In Brazil, the Supreme Court is about to judge Jair Bolsonaro for leading an attempted coup following his defeat in 2022 election. Some analysts say Brazil is doing what the United States failed to do with Donald Trump after January 6, 2021. So has V-Dem also followed this process of the rise of the far right in Brazil, right?
Absolutely. And I agree completely with that judgment. The so-called January 6th uprising in United States was no more or no less than a coup attempt. That was clear. In any international comparison, that will be called a coup attempt. And United States have failed to prosecute people appropriately. And Donald Trump, first day in office, even gave clemency to the 1,500 people involved in this, including those who were part of beating up police officers and so on and so forth, storming the Capitol, saying they would hang the vice president. Um, and they were pardoned. And Trump was never prosecuted. So that's a major blowback to democracy, and in my judgment, a major mistake in American history.
Professor, the study identifies ongoing autocratization processes in Mexico, Argentina, and Peru. And I have two questions about that. First, which Latin America country is currently raising the most concern? And in which category would Brazil fit right now?
So, starting with Brazil, Brazil is, in our measures, on its way back up after Bolsonaro went out of power and the new coalition of parties put Lula in power. That, by the way, is quite common. I mean, Brazil is very similar to countries like even Zambia or Poland, where a broad coalition of parties and social forces get together to get rid of an autocratizing leader in power. So Brazil, in many ways, remind about other countries that have turned around. Um, Now, Mexico is kind of an odd case because it's one of the few countries these last 25 years um, where a left wing government is autocratizing. So, in the past, of course, if we go back to the 60s and 70s, there are many countries where the left, extreme left, communist, socialist, created one party states and did away with democracy. But these past 25 years, it's very rare. So you have Venezuela and now Mexico in Latin America, two of the very few cases. So in that sense, Mexico is worrying. But um, I think there are many signs. I mean, all the signs of autocratization, of doing away with democracy or sedimenting autocracy, like in Nicaragua or Venezuela, is very concerning in my mind.
Professor, according to Democracy Report, almost all aspects of democracy are declining in more countries than they are improving compared to 10 years ago. What are these aspects?
Yeah, so It's a very steep increase in the last, especially 10 to 15 years, of countries in the world that are autocratizing. I think beyond the factors that I mentioned, China, Russia, Saudi Arabia, socioeconomic inequality, and rise of far right populism in its wake, um, it also shows on what we call diffusion in technical terms. So the more countries that are autocratizing and then become autocracies, um, the more their influence in the world spreads, and they start to affect other countries. And it's very obvious right now with Trump in power in the United States, and you in Brazil are affected by it in so many ways, including the new tolls, of course. That steep increase also means that the world of autocracies, they are getting more powerful, and they know it. And that makes us who still live in democracies, who want democracy and human rights and freedom, um, we should become even more concerned.
On the other hand, Professor, 19 countries are undergoing democratization. This number has fluctuated between 15 and 20 since 2014. But what are the most notable processes about this movement?
Well, the most notable is that they're very small countries, tend to be very small countries. So, in that regard, Brazil, now sort of democratizing after a period of downturn, is an odd case. Um, so, it's more typical with the Seychelles, right? 90,000 inhabitants out there in the Indian Ocean. Uh, Countries like the Gambia, small countries with small populations that are democratizing. And that has been sort of a trend over the past even 25 years, that large countries with large populations and big economies, they tend to autocratize, and small countries with small populations and small economies in the world have been the ones democratized.
And Professor, the results of Democracy Report 2025 concerned the scenario that existed up to the end of 2024. But I get from what you said in this interview that Donald Trump's inauguration and the way he has governed in his second term really concern you. So, how concerned are you, Professor, with Donald Trump's second term in the United States?
Very concerned. In my judgment, United States no longer qualifies as a democracy. It has joined the fray of what we call electoral autocracies. So it still has the trappings of democracy, but the institutions don't work anymore. We did a scientific analysis of this after published in a international journal, democratization, um, scientific journal, and that was after about 3 months in power. And already then, it seemed clear to us that there are so many breaches of democratic norms, so much undermining of democratic institutions, even breaking the constitution and many laws, um, that United States can no longer qualify as a democracy.
Professor, just one last question. Based on everything Democracy Report 2025 identified, is it possible to foresee some slowdown in this third wave of autocratization in the world, or does the end of this process not seem to be near?
We see no signs of even slowing down of the trend of autocratization in our data. What we do know historically, but also from countries like Brazil and Poland and others who have turned around, is that popular popular support, popular engagement, mass movements out on the street and fighting for democracy, that is one key to turning things around. So to everyone who is watching this, and then speak to your friends and post on social media and so on, that's a key message to take home. People, you the people, we the people matter. And if we decide not to accept autocracy, it is very hard to force it upon us if we go out and engage in mass demonstrations, in protests, and organize ourselves.
Thank you very much for the interview, Professor. See you next time.
Thank you for having me.
E para vocês que acompanharam esta entrevista, curtiram esta entrevista, não se esqueçam, claro, de deixar o seu like neste vídeo, de se inscrever no canal de Carta Capital no YouTube e de acessar sempre o www.cartacapital.com.br. Um grande abraço a todos e até a próxima.